Hi, and welcome back to the second part of this responsive web design that we're currently talking about. So, the media queries I mentioned earlier is these we use to actually detect the resolution of the device we're using to actually look upon what we created. So, if we're using an iPhone or an Android or whatever we're using, or if we're using a desktop computer, a tablet, watches, or anything that actually has a screen that can show this. So we're going to look at how we can actually start doing this and breaking down the process of these different things. This is just a way to create it, and this would be inside a CSS file, not the HTML, but the CSS file. So we could just pretty much copy all this and implement this into our CSS. But let's go through with what it actually means. In the CSS, we could start at the top or at the bottom, whatever you want to start it, by typing @media, in this case screen, because we want it to be able to only be detectable by screens. We could also use print if it's only for printable things. But here we're targeting the screen here. We're setting a min and a max width, and then we are setting this WebKit min pixels ratio, which I'll get back to in a few slides forward. But here we're actually stating the breakpoints of the screen. So min and max width, if it's minimum width of 1200, it's going to do this, and it's a maximum width of 1600, it's going to do this. You're ending all this, like we see here, media screen, and this part, and max width, and WebKit. Then we are starting this to where we can create our CSS with a curly bracket here. So inside this curly bracket is where we're going to put all our CSS. It's really important that it's inside these. So open it, close it before actually starting to type anything. Super important. In here we can put everything we want. Background color goes to yellow instead of white, or whatever we want. This could be a standard setup for screens. So change it when you reach the specific width in pixels. This is for a non-retina screen. And if you don't know what retina is, you can actually Google it, but it's usually what we talk about when we have really high resolutions on. So in the case of my computer, which is an Apple, it has a retina screen because the resolution is so high. And usually the newer phones, well, if not all the newer phones, have a retina screen. Retina screen, we also have a specific setting for this, which is shown down here, where we have basically the same thing, but we're adding just a few extra things. So we still have the same mix min and max width, and instead of having WebKit min pixels ratio 1 like up here, we have 2. And then we have a min resolution of 192 dpi. This means that if the browser or whoever's watching our page is a retina screen and has a minimum resolution of 192 dpi, it's going to start calculating things for us, because it's really hard to hit specific mobile phones if the resolution is really big. Maybe they're above 1200, but that would have to mean that if we're using a little bit older computer, maybe we'll actually have a mobile look on that. That won't work. So we're using this here, WebKit min pixels ratio and resolution. If and when I put in a number here, in this case 2, and its resolution is minimum of this, it's going to divide these numbers up here when it's a retina screen. So instead of actually looking at 1200, it's going to be looking at 600 pixels. Here, 1600 will actually be divided by 2, so it's going to be equal 800 pixels. So we can actually target specific phones by using these specific rules. The examples will probably show a little bit more of this. Other ways of using this min-max is like this, so we can divide them up even more. Again, here we have media screen and min-width 900 pixels. So if it's a minimum width of 900, do this. If it has a maximum width, do something else. So we can just divide them up and create them in the way that you actually think is the best for you to understand. So there's not one way that's more correct than the other. That's the thing about CSS and HTML. As I mentioned before, we always design for mobile first because there's optimization processes to go through, and of course it will load faster than this. So we're going to create most of our CSS, if not all our CSS for mobiles first, or smaller devices. The smaller the devices, the quicker you're going to create this. And then you build upon to change it back to the desktop version where we get more and more and more stuff, because then we maybe have more transitions and transforms and so on in our CSS. Right. This is just yet another example. Here's is actually a CSS3 rule we can use to actually make our work a lot easier, not harder, that would be not smart. But here we're actually making the CSS or the system help us. So I'll just quickly go through what actually happens here. This part, if you can see the mouse where it says add media only screen and min width 768 pixels, and then we have our curly brackets, our comment, and then we have our classes down here. So column 1, column 2, column 3, and they are set with a width of a percentage. So depending on the screen, it will just expand the width, so it's always 8.33% in column 1, and so on and so on. This little CSS here is actually a smart way for us to change something when we know we're going to a mobile view. So because we're changing it from a desktop to a mobile, we want the width of these specific columns to change so everything fits the screen. So they want to be 100% of the screen instead of 8%. You couldn't hit a 8% of your mobile screen. That's going to be really hard. So we're going to do this. We can do this. We can create a bracket like this, type in class, because class equals the dot down here. In CSS, if it was an ID, we would use a hashtag here instead of the dot. And star here means we're going to select all classes that equals and apostrophes, an apostrophe here, COL dash. This is the same as COL dash. We're not putting in the numbers unless that's supposed to be specified, but that makes no sense then. So we're going to hit every column that starts with .col dash, and the number doesn't matter. So from 1 to 1 million or unlimited number will be changed. So the width will go from this to 100%, so it's going to fit in the screen. This is a really smart little piece of CSS3 that can do calculations for you and minimize what you have to create and type and test. This works on everything. I quickly just talked about the ratio statement before. This is just another way of looking at it if we want to. As I mentioned before, depending on what sort of screen we're using, if we're using a retina display, we can divide the numbers by 2. We can actually add a 3, and then in this case 600 would actually go all the way down to 200 pixels. But the calculation is at the bottom here where it says the design resolution equals 600 pixels divided by 2 equals 300. And again, if we just put in a 3, it would be 200 instead. So it's easier for us to target these newer and better maybe not better, but these newer phones with a higher resolution and a higher retina screen to actually be able to create a mobile view for them. We can also create mobile views just by typing in landscape or portrait, but I'll also show you. So it would go up here. Instead of typing in the width, we can just type in which if it should be landscaping or it should be portrait instead. These are just some extra things. This is for your HTML again. In your HTML, all the things I just talked about is put in your CSS file. This would go in your HTML file in the top of your page, so in the header sorry, not the header, the head HTML, where you have all the other things like meta descriptions and so on. Here we have something called meta name viewport, content width equals device width. So this is actually looking at the device we're using and seeing what width it's using. So it's actually doing a calculation here, and this is the calculation we're going to use. If, for example, type minimum width 862 pixels, it's going to check up here if it's the same, smaller, or less. Initial scale means it's going to zoom the scale to 1. So it actually, if you create 100% width, it fits on your screen. You can try removing this and see if there's any changes. Down here we have, this is just bonus things. This is not needed to create. This is just something to help. This is 4 lines you can just copy paste into the top of your, again, into the head section of your HTML. And it's actually going to check the browser the user is using. So if they're using Internet Explorer 7, 8, or newer than 8. So if LT, which means lesser than or older than Internet Explorer 7, do this. If it's using 7, 8, or if it's using greater than 8. And this is just something that's already pre-programmed. So if we're using any of these, the page is actually going to prompt us that, or the user, that you're using a older version, maybe everything won't work because we're using new ways of designing a new CSS. So it's prompting people to either get a new or newer version of Internet Explorer or just a newer browser, like Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and so on. So this is not needed. This is just something to help us to make sure our design actually gets to the user. Thank you. And for the next video, we'll go into some examples.